Welcome to Searching for the Question Live. Thank you for joining the show. We are streaming on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube simultaneously. And you can, since we are live, comment on each of them. And if your comments are relevant and interesting, I will be able to bring them in and we will answer live or make our own comments back to you. You can also subscribe to the channel on YouTube, of course, and be alerted when we have new shows scheduled. And you can also join our Discord channel where we are continuing the conversations around the numerous themes that are addressed on Searching for the Question Live. If you want, you can also suggest new guests and vote on those suggested by others. And finally, if you appreciate the content that I create together with my team, you are more than welcome to become a fan, a supporter, a sponsor, or a benefactor on patreon.com/David Orban with the various tiers that are available and at your disposal. So in this episode, we are going to talk about startup societies, special economic zones, in general, how competition is actually moving to the level of countries in a very new way than what used to be the case maybe 100 years ago, where the only tool available would have been a war to conquer a given territory, and that would be it. Either you won and then you competed out the other guy, or you lost and then your bet didn't work out. And I guess you went back to the drawing board like Germany did after the first attempt to try a second time. That didn't work either back then. And to have this conversation, we have a wonderful guest, Joe McKinney, who is the CEO and co-founder of the Startup Societies Foundation, as well as the CEO of Nuhanse Network. The first is a nonprofit that is analyzing how startup societies and special economic zones can form. And the second is a for-profit that provides consultation around these, as well as in e-governance applications. So welcome, Joseph, to Searching for the Question Live.
Hey, David, it's a pleasure to be on.
Thank you very much. So as we were starting, I told you that I like to show to our viewers the places that we touch. A few hours ago, we were live with a guest from Taipei, Taiwan, which is right here in the South China Sea. I didn't even realize that it was so close to the Philippines. I thought it was farther up north, but no. And right now, we are talking with you, and you are in Barranquilla in Colombia. Right around the world. There you go. And you are in a tropical location as well, right? How is the weather over there?
Oh, it's wonderful. Just make sure you got to have a good air conditioner at all times. But it's absolutely beautiful here in Barranquilla.
And do you go swimming in the sea often? It's very close.
Yeah, so there's some better beaches in nearby cities like Cartagena and Santa Marta. And we probably would have gone to them a lot more, but I moved here around in February and right when the lockdowns happened. So haven't had the chance yet.
And how is that going? How is the pandemic being handled by Colombia, and how is it? How are you coping?
So me personally, my life hasn't really changed because I work remotely. I'm kind of a digital hermit. But Colombia has been an interesting case. It's actually one of the most regulated countries in terms of COVID-19. We're allowed to go out once a week, depending on the last digit of our ID number. And that used to be even less. It was about 2 or 3 weeks. Some days there's just complete lockdown of everything. It hasn't been tremendously helpful. Cases have gone exponential. So that's kind of situation, but we're fine. I mean, prior to this, we didn't go out very frequently anyways. We kind of live on the internet, so it's not an issue.
And is it because even though the imposition by the government was theoretically strict, compliance was an issue? I see that 77,000 cases on a population that I don't know how big is Colombia. I could Google it right away. Do you remember the number?
Not off the top of my head, but
yeah, let me check it out. Let's go here as well. Colombia population.
It's about 50 million.
50 million. So on a per million basis, the number of infections is high, even though not as high as in some other countries, and the number of deaths. So do you know if the issue was indeed lack of compliance?
Yes, I mean, so it's definitely not lack of enforcement, because they definitely crack down when they can. But the issue is that a lot of people they can't live that way. They're not like I, who's lives in a pre-privileged position where I can work remotely on my computer. A lot of people working in a formal economy, they have to work outside, and also just the culture. It's about being outside, being around your neighbors. So generally speaking, they've been flaunting it. That's not to say the government hasn't been taking some measures to reduce it. It just hasn't been really enforceable.
And what is the level of the social safety net? Because in those countries where the personal savings or the household savings are not enough, of course, either you go hungry or you go out, or the government helps you. So what is the situation with regards to that in Colombia?
It's a pittance. It's really not what's necessary in order to survive. It's pretty frightening, to be completely honest. So people like there's avocado sellers that are out every single day, or cheese sellers, and they were completely gone before. But even though there's lockdown, every single day we hear the calls for avocados all the time because they need to work to survive.
Exactly. There were other guests on Searching for the Question Live from India or South Africa, and that is indeed the case in many other places in the world, where people earn the money that they need in order to eat the next day, or even pay rent next day, or the night, the very night. And so if they do nothing because they are locked down, they cannot have a shelter anymore, and it is really a tragic situation for a lot of people. And what made you choose Colombia before the pandemic? Some people ended up, for example, in New Zealand, and they were like, we thought we came here because it was one of the safest places on the planet, but we didn't realize it would come true to this degree so fast.
Yeah, so the reason I'm here is I moved here with my girlfriend, Dr. Meza Garcia, who's actually also an expert in the startup society space. She has a consultancy company or a business development company for floating developments and floating startup societies.
Oh, wonderful.
And
she's available and would like to join, we can share with her the URL and she can pop in.
Well, Natalie, if you're hearing and you want to join the call, no pressure, but you're invited. But yeah, she's from Barranquilla, and there she is. She's saying hi. Do you want to we could give you the link, or you could just say hi briefly.
I think it is.
Yeah, she's going to finish an email real quick, but then she'll join us.
Okay, and then my preference would be, rather than the two of you sharing the tiny space on the same camera, for her to hop in from another location?
Yeah, she has a computer in another room. She'll join via that.
Perfect.
Yeah. She's a Biracanera. She's originally from here, and she finished her PhD at Warwick University. And she wanted to return here and take all the information about good governance and floating developments and help her country. And there's a lot of opportunities here. This place actually is very known for zones. There's a special economic zone framework here, and it's Colombian zones are pretty well rated. And in fact, Barranquilla specifically has always been known as a port city. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was called the Golden Door to Latin America, especially Colombia. And the name's still kind of stuck. And there's still a lot of zones here. And hopefully they're going to create a new zone framework, and they're going to attract even more developments here in Barranquilla.
So let's take a step back and tell me first, what are special economic zones? And then how did you start to be interested in them?
Sure. So a special economic zone is an area within a host jurisdiction that has different policies or laws. This could be something as banal as tariff reductions or streamlined customs procedures, but it could also be other taxes. It could also be more interesting and have different regulatory codes for different sectors or different technologies. And the most interesting types of policies are having different legal systems that are based on best practices that attract businesses and tenants. And also there's a broad of residential incentives. And the reason I got interested in them is because I came from a free market mentality in my more dogmatic era. And I really wanted to make something happen, but I realized that it wasn't really possible on the electoral scale. So I looked at entrepreneurship and different projects, and I started researching these types of projects, that there was these new jurisdictions and that they were actually happening all over the world. And I realized that this was an avenue of applying the startup methodology of starting small and scaling, but for policies. And I thought it was just a bunch of crazy libertarian experiments, but they're actually widespread all around the world. There's 5,400 around the world. They indirectly make up hundreds of millions of dollars of jobs around the world, and hundreds of millions in indirect jobs. And at least 1% of all global trade is through special economic zones. And they make up some of the biggest cities in the world, like Shenzhen or Dubai. Oh, sorry,
exactly.
you have a question.
As an example, to make it concrete, I would really cite, for example, Shenzhen, because it is in an totally unexpected source in terms of an authoritarian central government that has been able to realize that it was in their interest to run an economic experiment, which was hugely influential and kind of infected with its own policies the remainder of its host country. So we are talking about Shenzhen in China and the rest of China.
Yes, and it was implemented for some of the same reasons that I got interested in SEZs in the first place. Existing nation states are so captured by special interest and momentum that they can't make large-scale reforms. So what China did after the Great Leap Forward, and they had tremendous famine, is they knew they needed to have reform, but they couldn't do it over a large scale. So they realized that some of these business people in China were trying to make reforms on a local level, and then they sort of endorsed those projects. And Shenzhen was one of the first of those projects to set up its own laws and legal system that was conducive to trade and investment, et cetera. And it started with a fishing village of 30,000 people, and now has a population of 18 million and a gross domestic product equivalent to Ireland, Portugal, or Vietnam. So that's a miracle. And now there are dozens, if not hundreds, of special economic zones in China right now.
And so what is the starting point is that you believe that the kind of experimentation that is possible in the special economic zones is necessary in order to further human development and degrees of freedom that otherwise wouldn't be available.
Exactly. We think it unlocks a potential that is latent in these areas, and you see that in Dubai, and you see that in China. Sorry, just as a side note, Natalie is ready for the call. So if you have a a link that we can send her?
Same link. I don't have her email, so
I
if
can
you
send that then.
copy the URL from the top and
Perfect.
just send it to her through whatever means, that's
Perfect.
it. And Francisco is going to be very happy because he has been clamoring for Natalie to come in.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Awesome.
I have no idea who Francisco is, of course.
Oh,
but
hey, Francisco.
he's a fan.
Awesome. Okay, yeah, sending that right now. Okay. Yeah, but to answer your question, yeah, there's just barriers that nation states put in the way in the policy side that when unleashed, it can be absolutely amazing. And like another example is Dubai. So Dubai was extraordinarily dependent on oil revenues to get by, and you see these famous pictures of Dubai as just this absolute desert. But what you don't see is that it formed dozens of different special economic zones within that small area. One of them was the Dubai International Financial Center, which is on the cutting edge of SEZs around the world. It has its own independent legal system that's built into the constitution of both Dubai and the United Arab Emirates. It has its own regulatory code, taxation system, and is run very similar to a private corporation. You can even see their chief executive officers on Crunchbase. You can see their revenues. They report all of this very regularly every single year, like a company.
I want to bring that up. So if I go to Crunchbase and I go like the Dubai CEO, that will be
the Dubai International Financial Center.
Okay, and this entity, sorry, for some reason it didn't come up.
Well, maybe it's because it's the British spelling.
Not the Dubai, not the World Trade Center, right?
Right.
Is that it?
Yeah, that should be it. Let me see. Yeah, right here. I have it right here. I can send it on the private chat.
Okay.
Okay. And it calls itself a financial services company.
And so that has an ability to operate not only in terms of economic policy, but also it properly manages the lives of the people in the area, right?
Well, yeah, it leases out land to developers to create residences and what have you. Hey,
Hello,
Natalie.
Hello. Welcome. I'm sorry to photobomb your podcast, your live interview.
No. Absolutely, you are totally welcome, and thank you very much for being so flexible. And I will let Joe finish to talk about Dubai a little bit, and then we will go and listen to your specialty around floating jurisdictions instead, which is absolutely fascinating. So please, Joe.
Sorry. You want me to continue? You said, or what?
Yes, please finish about Dubai. Yes.
Yeah. So it's on the cutting edge. It's run like a private company. It has its own legal system that can be updated, and it updates it to its court system website. We even had some of the people that helped found the legal system at our recent virtual event. The legal system is based on best practices in Welsh and English common law. And lawyers are very familiar with that system. It's used all around the world. Regrettably, that's because of a lot of colonialism. But the thing that makes it interesting for a lot of investors is that they're very familiar with it. So they can port over a lot of their understanding with British law and able to apply it there. And one of the things that made it so interesting for a lot of people is that in that area, they have laws against usury. Islamic finance prohibits usury. And what the Dubai International Financial Center is provides a small little haven where people can provide interest loans in order to finance things in the Middle East. So it's kind of like a special economic zone for interest on loans, so it does other things as well.
Fascinating. So Natalie, as a surprise guest, I am very curious about your background to start with a little bit. Tell us about yourself. You were born in Colombia, as I understand, right? And then you just completed your PhD. Joseph was telling us. Tell us about your trajectory. How did you arrive to do the kind of studies that you did?
Awesome. So first, thank you very much for having me impromptu here. I was really enjoying listening to Joe's interview from my office. So yeah, I was born in Colombia and I've just finished my PhD in the UK at the University of Warwick. I was studying the floating island project in French Polynesia, which was a case to build a floating special economic zone in the territorial waters of French Polynesia. While I was doing my PhD studying this project, I had two hats. So I was also the spokesperson internationally of the company building the floating island project. So I had kind of two conflicting hats in that sense. I didn't have any jurisdiction in French Polynesia. My outreach was just international. And right now, I'm the CEO of CFIA, which is a business development company for floating projects, where my approach to floating developments with special regulations is very much, in a way, the contrary of what I saw in the project that I was involved with in French Polynesia. So the project lacked a lot of true, honest, local stakeholder engagement. It also didn't really have a business plan that justified why floating or why special regulations in the first place, and it wasn't really catered towards the local community. So, it has some flaws, and I learned a lot by being in it, and I do believe and I do see the benefit, if done correctly, of localizing. Yeah.
Could you repeat? Could you spell the name of the latest project that you mentioned that you just?
My company.
Yes.
Sophia, like this. The name. So Sophia is knowledge in ancient in Greek, and sea, ocean. So Sophia. It started as a consulting company, but I've moved more and more towards the business development side because it seems that a lot of people want to build floating developments with special regulations and even without. So I cater these needs, especially in Latin America, which is where I'm from. So
we are putting a lot of wood on the fire, but we are smart people. It's not a problem for sure. Our listeners won't mind. So we went from special economic zones that enable a given jurisdiction to experiment and then draw the right conclusions, hopefully. And now you are introducing the issue of these potentially being floating. Why is that an advantage rather than just a headache?
Well, so it started the other way around. 10 years ago, there was a group of people at the Seasteading Institute who saw international waters as a way to create communities that had private governments that people could voluntarily attach to. Just like Joe was saying, people can register their business in Dubai. They choose to do that because it has favorable regulations. Well, the idea of seasteading was that people could ascribe to different governance service providers, not just commercial call, but also legal services and protection and things like that. And that was 10 years ago. And research showed that building a floating community in international waters, it's really very challenging from the legal point of view. So the strategy that the Institute took was, okay, let's just start, instead of international waters, let's just partner with coastal nations and build a floating project in the territorial waters. And why floating in international waters? Well, the idea was that if you could float your house around, governments would have an incentive of performing better, because if they didn't, then people just take their house and float it somewhere else. In reality, the bigger you go, the more difficult it is to implement this type of dynamic geography. But that's how the project in French Polynesia emerged, by searching for a coastal nation that would be interested in building floating developments, in this case because of its sea level rise issues.
And with the CFIA, did you already decide where you would ideally start? What would be the most welcoming nation state that is ready to take advantage of what could happen?
Well, there's actually many places that are looking at floating developments. Just today, I found out that Dubai learned that land reclamation is kind of problematic, and now they are moving to floating islands. But I am looking at different, me and my team, I work with the architects from the Netherlands, Blue21, blue21.nl is their website. And we are exploring different locations that, instead of starting with the governance, focus on the business case. So we're looking at first the business case, and then we look at the regulatory framework that can enable it. So, well, yeah, somewhere there near those bounds. For example,
so what you are saying is that this was a very ambitious engineering project, but the long-term viability is not yet assured, while putting something on the sea that is floating, if those seas are potentially raising in their level, the floating thing will just keep floating on top,
exactly.
even when potentially the palms will be like Atlantis underwater.
Exactly. So this project is really cool, but it requires a lot of money to maintain it. But with floating, you have to spend less money in maintenance. Also, the deeper the water, then the cheaper it is. But going back to what Joe was saying about people voluntarily deciding to go to a place with regulations that are favorable, what we are looking right now in CFIA is what business cases could really benefit from having a location that is on the water. So, for example, there's many blue economy and especially blue tech companies, blue tech hubs that work with underwater drones for doing water quality testing. And also a lot of, although this is not my favorite at all because I'm vegan, aquaculture and things like that. So yeah, and if you, on top of the floating aspect with a competitive advantage for businesses to be on the water, you put a regulatory framework that attracts companies in this specific industry that you want to focus on, then what you can end up with is something like what Joe was saying, a project like Dubai that, despite its small size, has managed to create and concentrate a lot of economic wealth.
So thank you very much, Natalie. That is absolutely fascinating. Joe, in the introduction, I mentioned Startup Societies Foundation and Nuhanse Network. One is a nonprofit, the other is a for-profit. What is the relationship and what is the difference?
Sure. So Startup Societies, the nonprofit, the goal was that we saw a bunch of these projects in the space, especially a lot of the innovative ones, but they kept making the same mistakes. And they didn't know that there were examples to draw from. They also didn't know there was a whole network of organizations that were working on precisely the same goal. So what we decided was that we wanted to create a nonprofit network that would connect everyone together and share best practices to make that happen. And initiatives that we do to drive precisely that is we do obviously a lot of popular content in terms of blogs, podcasts. We also did a lot of trade show conferences, including the virtual conference that we had fairly recently. And one of our more recent things is we opened up the only academic journal regarding special jurisdiction governance. The journal is called the Journal of Special Jurisdictions. We also published a 600-page how-to manual on how to make special jurisdictions and startup societies based on best practices, and includes template legislation, template concession agreements, pro formas, really nitty-gritty stuff. And so combining all these things together, we have a lot of best practices for everyone. So that's a description of.
Sorry, the guide that you mentioned is this one, Founding Startup Societies, this book?
Yes, that's it. co-written by our chairman, Mark Fraser, and I.
Okay, wonderful. So yes, please go ahead. I see this is the Journal of Special Jurisdictions. This is the scientific publication. Is it an open publication? Okay, wonderful.
Anyone could submit a paper. You don't have to pay anything at all, and you can submit. And I think your listeners will actually like this particular issue. It's about special jurisdictions and non-territorial governance. And there's a lot of it regarding blockchain technology and crypto democracy, open source legal systems, etc. So I think that might be something that your listeners would be very interested in.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, let's put more on the fire. That's right. A lot of what you are saying is exciting, but I believe that even though there is a lot of enthusiasm and there are hundreds of zones or more, in some way there is a self-limiting factor given that it is linked to the land, right? And there is only so much land available until we colonize the solar system, but even then it will be
Natalie makes more of it, but yeah, okay.
That's right. So we can build take all the wasted matter in Jupiter and Saturn and then build wonderful colonies out of that, and that will be cool. But until we get there, to design new ways of belonging to some experiment that doesn't depend on the exclusive physical location is less limiting. Actually, there is no upper bound, because I could belong to 2 or 10 or 100 different special economic zones, each of them different and each of them competing for my talent, for my attention, for my enthusiasm, right?
Yep. I think, Joe,
oh, go ahead, Alec.
I was just going to say that you are the right person to answer this question with your recent, about 2 months research on e-residence programs for special economic zones and other types of digital zone systems.
Sure. No, I can definitely talk about e-residency. I do want to make a quick point because you showed the Wikipedia of Georgism. I do want to say, and Mark Fraser actually writes quite a bit about this, and we wrote a blog post for way back. There's been a lot of comparisons to startup societies to private Georgism. So most startup societies are on a land lease model, meaning that you have a private organization that has a 100-year lease or what have you, or it freeholds the land and then leases that out to developers and sub-developers and people underneath it. And people have often said that the ground leases, the ensuing ground leases, are very similar to a land value taxation system. So it's completely congruent with the idea of Georgism. In fact, I considered myself a geo-libertarian at a certain point, or a Georgist in my earlier years. And it was just nice that somehow it kind of coincided. On the technological component, jurisdictional arbitrage traditionally, meaning that going to a different legal system to enjoy its benefits or streamlined procedures, traditionally has only been bestowed by people who physically relocate to those areas. That has changed for a while. I mean, the most basic example that a lot of people know is registering a company in a different jurisdiction that you don't live. A lot of people do that with Delaware corporations, or setting up a Cayman Island bank account, what have you. But recently, the digital element of it has really come to the fold, and it's with the pioneering work of Estonia and the e-residency system. And they get to enjoy the regulatory framework of Estonia. It's relatively flat tax procedures, and also just streamlined procedures. And what this has opened up the door for is the idea that special jurisdictions have the ability to provide jurisdictional arbitrage as a service, not just to people that physically relocate to the zone, but also by providing an online platform that allows people to register businesses, register a corporation there, pay taxes, distribute shares, and enjoy the regulatory and legal code, and resolve disputes. digitally, but based on the jurisdictional authority of the special zone.
And Natalie said that you just completed a study, a comparative study of different e-residency programs. What are your conclusions? Is there a best one, and should I immediately apply? I'm already an Estonian e-resident.
Oh, Joe has a better version of it.
Yeah.
In the
Well,
work.
it's not so much an academic comparative study, it's more like market research because of so you asked me to compare SSF to Nuhanse. So Nuhanse, what it does is it provides early stage policy implementation for really innovative zones, and also technology to create e-residency and e-governance for the zones. And we create that type of e-residency, so we have to like sort of map out in the pro forma.
So this study and its conclusions are a product that Nuhanse provides to its clients.
Yeah, so a couple of places. So one such project that I can talk about right now, in broad terms, is that we're working with a Native American tribe to create an e-residency system based on the legal framework that they would create.
Very, very interesting. So one of the things that is fascinating is that as you know, as you are talking, I am Googling and pulling in links, etc., etc. So I wanted to pull in links regarding jurisdictional arbitrage. And I chose not to because all of the links concern multinationals. But the point is that the effect of all of this innovation is, as always, you know, whether we are talking about the steam engine or mobile phones or advanced computers, the opportunity is for the democratization of the product or the service or the process that used to be available only for a very select exclusive audience, but now it is available to anybody. If you are an Indian coder, you can be applying the jurisdictional arbitrage that the Estonian e-residency makes available to you, opening a business that has immediate ability to trade with 500 million European Union residents. So that is extremely powerful.
I absolutely love that thought, and I want to give an analogy. I mean, obviously, a lot of people in the space like to make startup like a startup or computer analogies, and the perfect one is a computer or a smartphone. Before cell phones or computers were purely the realm of the rich, and they were really, really expensive. Likewise, jurisdictional arbitrage right now is pretty much in the realm of the rich and multinationals, or it's increasingly not, obviously, but certainly in the past. And the point of that as a market mechanism is you create a high price point and you introduce other people into the market. And what that did in the realm of cell phones and computers is that it brought more home computers and cheaper computers and reduced the price over time. What we kind of hope to do by helping form the marketplace of entrepreneurs in governance is to provide lower cost services to people to partake in jurisdictional arbitrage and have better governance without having to be a multinational or be incredibly rich, and to the point where competitive governance, like having a cell phone in your pocket, is commonplace. And that means that people have to provide, or governments or companies that are providing governance services provide the best service for you and don't just take advantage of your money or your freedom or equity or what have you.
Now, an important concept when we talk about disruptive innovation is that the incumbents will resist as much as they can if they realize what is going on. And, you know, Kodak didn't and the Nokia didn't. But, for example, the US financial services industry very much did and has been successfully lobbying for favorable legislation that would keep blockchain innovation at bay, so that their ridiculous practices of, I don't know, a 2-3% tax on every financial transaction because you are doing it with a 70-year-old infrastructure called a credit card would stay in place. and that kind of immune system, if you raise the level of abstraction and you talk about nation states, becomes even more dangerous, because of course they can kill you legally, and that was part of the plot of the transhumanist wager from Zoltan Ishtan a few years ago. I am not going to spoil the book if someone wants to pick it up and read it, but the protagonist establishes a floating hub for advanced scientific experiments, and a lot of nation states in the world that don't like that. And I believe that it is what is happening in the USA that is one of the few countries that has legislation for universal taxation based on your citizenship rather than on your place of residency. At the cost of renouncing US citizenship has been increasing dramatically, as well as the time it takes. So if we project this out in time, then what could happen, and whether it will or not, we'll see, but what could happen is that it becomes, to be a US citizen becomes a kind of vassalage on planet Earth, where it doesn't matter where you live, more and more people will not be able to afford to stop paying taxes to the US because it will cost more to not be a citizen. And maybe it will take a lifetime to stop being a citizen. And then if you have if you happen to be born a US citizen, that will be it. You will be until you die.
Yeah, it's a problem. First, I'd like to address the first concern that you had, that governments will try to stomp out incumbents. So that could definitely be a worry, especially as the movement grows. But one thing to note is they've already opened Pandora's box. You know, there's 5,400 around the world. They've been in existence since 1945, and they've grown increasingly in regulations. I mean, in regulatory power and legal power, and they make becoming a more dominant part about the economy. So it's increasingly hard for them to do that, especially since it's an international market for zones. If one jurisdiction closes it, another one would benefit from it. And that's precisely the reason why there's no recorded case of a host jurisdiction getting rid of or expropriating a special economic zone to date. It's because of the spillover effects and the impact on the economy are so great. Another thing that we recommend in the book is revenue sharing with local governments to make sure that they have a very direct economic incentive to maintain it and to grow it. So if developers move forward with that in mind, they can do fairly well. In terms of U.S. vassalage, that is something that is a little bit perturbing. I would say, though, it's one of the reasons why we're moving into special zones within the United States, especially as the economy in the United States continues to falter, both relative to its standing and also nominally. It's going to become increasingly important. And a lot of people in the United States are continually rethinking institutions, especially in the wake of all of this. So we're working on zones there. We've even partnered with a U.S. venture firm as a venture partner to select special economic zone projects across the world. They're forming an SEZ fund specifically for this, and one of the first projects working with the native tribe for specifically that.
And is that Patri's fund?
No, this is Stat Zero.
Okay. Is there any relationship with Patri's fund?
So Patry, he's the chairman of the board of the Startup Society's foundation, and the relationship between Stat Zero and Pronomos, there isn't really right now. We're still forming the fund, but Patry is focusing on accelerator type investments right now. We'd be looking for sort of like Series A. So it's sort of like the relationship between let's say, like, this isn't exactly a fair analogy because of it's putting some sort of hierarchy, but like Y Combinator versus Andreessen Horowitz. That's a really bad analogy because we're not even formed yet, so I don't like that, but kind of get the idea.
All right, very good. and good luck. Forming a fund is a big endeavor. So I hope you will be very, very successful.
Yeah, we're the venture partners. We're not forming the fund, but yes, it'll be exciting.
Okay. So when we look at the tools that special economic zones employ, these are tools of policy and regulations. And just as from mere developing desktop and the mobile apps, now we realize that entire industries can be thought of as technologies themselves. And we talk about fintech, where banks are in panic because, for example, the EU said, well, if banks are technologies, then why don't we impose on banks the type of interoperability that portable document formats provided to users of computers? And it took a while, but today it is required by law in the EU that if you open an account in a neobank, like, for example, N26, and you happen to have an account in a traditional bank like HSBC or another, then HSBC has to be able to allow you to consolidate under a single user interface the information about your various accounts. And it is far from functioning still, even if it is a requirement, because banks are very slow. But the fact that the regulator has been able to understand what are the consequences of thinking about banks as platforms is by itself very, very interesting. So if we make a further step, then what we can talk about is regulatory technology, RegTech, and apply the type of thinking which you also mentioned is contained in the book in terms of best practices and recommendations of how to set up a startup society. But it also should be something that is maybe not on GitHub, but maybe it would be, right? If I want to do an e-residency program, then there is no reason why I shouldn't be able to fork the GitHub code that allows me to do that, marrying the things that the best can do, and then adding my own special sauce that will make it even better.
Totally. No, 100%. I mean, that's something that we like to do with Nuhanse. I mean, that's what we're doing with Nuhanse. We do RegTech and setting up corporations and facilitating working with banks that are registering on tribal lands, for instance. Also, you mentioned, well, there shouldn't be legal or regulatory work on GitHub. Well, we actually already do through the Startup Society Foundation. We have ULEX, an open source legal system created by the academic director of our research arm, the Institute for Competitive Governance. He created ULEX, an open source legal system based on private sources of best practice law from all around the world. And he put it all up on GitHub, and there's already been a couple of forks and additions to all of that. So you can just fork that. It's mostly legal software, not so much software as computer software, though we're working on that as well. But the principle remains. You can take this legal system, you can add additions to it, or you can have a different form of substantive law or different procedural rule, fork that, and that's your ULEX 3.0 or whatever you want to call it. And we're increasingly moving to that space where coders and regulators and lawyers are sort of merging into forming the governance as a service industry.
And what should I look for on GitHub?
So ULEX, so let's see, ULEX GitHub, and ULEX is spelled ULEX.
Perfect. Yep.
There's also a paper on it in the journal.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So ULEX open source Lexinonicon. I'll put that in the private chat.
Found it, sharing it. There you go. So Natalie, your CFIA, which is a wonderful word. Congratulations for coming up with it. Is new and exciting. And what are your next steps with it? What are your next challenges and next objectives?
So it's new and it's very exciting, and we are doing some progress. Our medium-term goal is to set up a floating blue hub for blue tech and blue economy startups and companies, so that we can propel the entire ecosystem in the Latin American coastal location. We're looking at a few, but there's one that is a bit more advanced. In the location where we locate. And we are taking some steps to get there. So this year, we are going to start with a climathon. So like a hackathon, but for ideas about how to tackle climate change, but specifically related to maritime technologies, shipping industry, ports, floating technologies, underwater data collection systems, and everything maritime / floating. So we are starting with a hackathon this year. Like a couple of weeks ago, I signed an MOU with Climate Kick, which is a program by the European Union that it's actually the largest green accelerator in the world. So we are doing the climathon with Climate Kick, exactly, in November this year, actually in the city where I am from and where Joe and I live, in Barranquilla, Colombia. Then next year, we are going to launch the accelerator program for blue technologies here in Barranquilla. And our aim is to attract maritime companies and startups and investors and NGOs and education programs to focus on maritime technologies. We're in conversations with the local government. Everything seems to be going well. They are very receptive to the idea. Sorry, that's my timer telling me to take a break, if you heard it. It's a bit loud sometimes. So our goal is to kickstart it from here, because as I said earlier, it's better if you begin where you are from, because you're familiar with the local culture, the local environment, you know, the people, all that. So, and then we hope that by 2022, we have our floating blue hub. So that's as far as I can give away right now at this point, but
of course.
It's going cool.
Very, very, very exciting, and congratulations. When you started your PhD, would you have imagined that you would shift so rapidly into becoming an entrepreneur?
Yes, but I didn't know I was going to end up working on floating, actually, because my hope was to get the PhD and then very romantically do something with it. That's not necessarily the path that you...
But more traditionally, people who get a PhD imagine themselves to become a researcher or a member of the faculty of an academic institution, right?
Yes.
In order to be an entrepreneur, you don't need a PhD.
No, you don't need a PhD, but I did want to... so in Colombia, I think it has to do specific with the Colombian context. Colombia, because of how the economy and the cultural setting is, like Joe was saying, is not a place where you can say easily, I'm going to be a football player, and then you do great, although there's great football players here. But you cannot say, I'm going to work as I'm going to be a librarian and have a good living standard, right? So education is here the main way to succeed, to be honest. There's also, if you are self-made, you have to be educated here. So it was my way to get a better place in life. And I wasn't thinking necessarily to stay in academia, and about 2 years into a PhD, I couldn't wait to get out of academia. And I finished a PhD, but now I am not in academia, but I am the editor of the Journal of Special Jurisdictions. But it's different because it's more a managerial role. You don't have to think every single word you say. But but when I started my PhD, I was looking to, I was very, half percent was of me, half of me was an anarchist. The other one wanted simply a system of decision making that allowed people more direct inputs into the outcome. So I started looking at digital democracy. I'm a bit embarrassed of saying this actually, and digital ways of creating new bills and new regulations. So I looked at the case of Finland, for example, with its online digital system for creating bills where 6,000 people in a Google Doc, for example, can draft a bill and then it passes through Congress. I thought that was great before I knew that it has to pass through Congress. So it's not really that direct democracy what you have there. So then I realized that if we really want to create changes, true deep changes with the way decisions are made and to stop the hierarchical form of decision making that we have in our representative democratic systems, we have to change the relation we have with the territory. That's how I got to seasteading and to other types of political ways of organizing that change the dynamic you have with the territory. So long story short, I wasn't thinking of staying in academia. I wasn't thinking of leaving. I did knew I was going to do something afterwards that wasn't going to have to do with academia.
My experience in analyzing and implementing accelerating technologies brought me to a realization many years ago that decentralization would be a very natural outcome, exactly because innovation can only happen at the edges. As the pressure of innovation increases, the ability of the center to adopt innovation goes down. So the periphery becomes stronger and stronger. And this is happening in many different areas independently from each other. Solar in energy, 3D printing and digital manufacturing, hydroponics and aquaculture, synthetic meat, personalized health, and so on and so forth. That is one of the reasons why, for me, when Bitcoin emerged, it wasn't very much a surprise. It was more like a welcome fulfillment of a necessary solution to a very clear issue. And I publicized this in my writings around network society, including the Network Society Manifesto and the fundamental thesis of the network society, that states how social innovation is enabled by technology and can only be sustainable if sufficiently advanced technologies are available at any given point. And today we are really in a point where it is becoming more and more evident to a larger and larger number of people that the nation state has kind of run its course. It has been a wonderful innovation 200-300 years ago, and it has been very successful to the point where it occupied basically all the landmass available except Antarctica. However, whether we are talking about climate change or we are talking about the emancipation and empowerment of billions of people who are struggling to get out of their lack of opportunity just because they were born at some given geography, or the pandemic, which is the latest crisis that nation states have proven to be completely unable to properly handle.
Yeah.
There is a need for something new to emerge.
Yeah.
Except that if we were happily using the blunt tools of wars and revolutions previously, today with nuclear arsenals in the thousands, it would be probably a stupid way of resolving increasing tensions in order to clean the slate and start anew. So the challenge really is that whatever new socioeconomic organization we build based on a new generation of technologies, it must be in parallel with the existing one. And so I think that is an interesting conclusion that we can come to if we must around special economic zones and startup societies. They can become the anchors on which the scaffolding on which we can build the novel structures while nation states decide whether they want to adapt to new needs or just peacefully dissolve themselves and become part of history.
Yes, I'm very glad you touched that point. My background is actually in complexity science. So I see the world through networks and topologies and different types of interactions among multiple levels and diversity of components. Those are the lenses through which I see the world. And through those same lenses, I saw that representative democratic systems are hierarchical, are pyramidal, are centralized, and that those types of systems, the information processing dynamics that these type of systems have, doesn't really match the network, multi-level, multi-scalar, interactive, bottom-up, also top-down, and just very diverse way of processing information in human social systems. So that mismatch causes huge tensions. So, for example, how do you really actually control 40 million people or 300 million people with one single hub? It's just not possible. You're going to have a bunch of conflicts there. And so my approach to governance was we have to change the topology of governance. We have to move to a topology or to a network structure that makes more sense with the type of structure that human societies have. And I completely agree with what you said. The emergence of parallel, multiple, decentralized, distributed, simultaneous special economic zones and startup societies all around the world is the result of that slow and sometimes sudden appearance of new ways for human societies to organize themselves in the transition towards ways of politically organizing that match better the topology of human social systems.
So the last provocation that I want to close with is an open question. I formulated about a year ago a new paradigm that looks at an increasing rate of acceleration where technological change is not merely accelerating, like, for example, Moore's law in computing, but like a rocket, as it is taking off, its acceleration itself is increasing. And we can already observe this super exponential rate in many technologies like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, DNA sequencing, and so on. And the question is, if we already have a hard time adapting to an exponential mindset, the disruption, the destruction even of jolting technologies, as I call them, could go beyond the limits of adaptability of both individual humans as well as human societies. And I don't have a good answer to that conundrum as of yet, but I think we don't have a lot of time to come up with an answer because these forces are already at play.
Yeah, I I would recommend you to look at Stuart Kaufman and his work on trying to find the fourth law of thermodynamics. And he has this, he didn't really find it, but he came to the following statement. He was talking about dissipative structures, but we can talk about life. Life and things should evolve as fast as they can. That's it. Not faster, not slower, just as fast as they can. And I think, yeah, but there's not just one answer. But that's
Okay,
I like that approach.
I love that. I love that, and I met Stuart, and I love his book, Rediscovering the Sacred, and Ilya Prigozhin, who started the studies on dissipative systems, of course, is a huge influence in current thinking around complexity and how complexity can arise in open systems. Which also transitions into political thinking through the Open Societies Foundation and their work. But we will have to go back and discuss this, Joseph and Natalie, in another episode of Searching for the Question Live, because even though this is exciting and very, very stimulating, this episode is over. Thank you very much for both of you to be part of the show.
Of course. Now we're done talking about the change. Now let's go make it. Thank you for having us on the show, David.
We have, rather than just talk, we have to do. Don't argue, build, like your slogan says.
Yeah.
All right, Natalie and Joseph, thank you very much for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
So thank you very much for joining Searching for the Question Live. You can look up all the links that we collected by going to the YouTube recording on the same URL that you watched the live stream. It will take us just a few hours maybe to post it in the show description, and then you will be able and really act on the various points that we raised by going as deep and as broad as you want. And if you like what you hear, you are welcome to become a supporter, a fan, a sponsor, a benefactor at various levels on patreon.com/David Orban. And I will see you at the next episode of Searching for the Question Live.